It was a year ago, Nick, a year ago, that one of us had the crazy idea of doing the Red Letter Challenge. Do you remember that? Yeah. A year ago. Lent last year at this time, we were going through this series called the Red Letter Challenge, and it was at that time, in no way on my radar, that I'd be standing here in front of the sanctuary at St. Mark Lutheran Church, preaching to both the congregations of St. Mark and the Congregation of Resurrection and those who are watching online. A lot has happened to get us here. A lot of really bad things, but also a lot of really amazing, powerful, God-driven things. More true any year than this year, hindsight is 20. Kind of ironic, kind of punny, but still. There are so many things to reflect on from this past year. So many things that we look back on and we see where we've messed up. We see where we've been frightened from. We see also where God has worked. Hindsight truly is 2020. And I think that's what our hope is for this series, the struggle. To not just look back on the struggles of our own lives, but also on the struggles of those who have come before us in the faith, like a king named David in the Old Testament. And I think our hope, if I can speak for both of us in this moment, if you allow me to do that, that in and through this series, that you can learn some tools to help you in the midst of struggle. But most importantly than just tools and ways to pray and things we can do, most importantly, I think our hope is that even in the midst of struggle, your very unique struggle to your life, that you have a God who's active in it with you, helping you get through it, giving you hope and joy in the midst of it, planting certainty and forgiveness for you while you're in it. I think that's our hope in this, especially this Lenten season as we launch towards the celebration of Easter, a celebration that I know, if I can speak for both of us, that we thoroughly enjoy, because it is the hope that we have. Now, before we get into Psalm 3, there's something we need to discuss, and that's injuries. Now, I'm not a very severe injury-prone person, but I have had my fair share of injuries, and really the most recent injury that I've had was at the gym. And we do these circuits where we go around, and there's different things at different stations that you do. Well, this was before 2020. But it was the very last station, and it was their strength station, and we were doing back squats. And I, being all big and strong and manly as I am, I loaded the bar up with weight after doing probably 45 minutes of strenuous exercise. What I didn't register in the midst of trying to be strong and lift as much weight as I could was that I was tired and my back was tired. And in the midst of squatting this weight, back squatting this weight, my back buckled. And I can actually still mentally feel what happened. But for about a few weeks, I could barely walk or stand. And every time I got up out of a chair, noise would come out of my mouth, whether I desired it to or not, groans and moans and effort. It was super painful. It hurt really bad. What was the most recent injury you've had? Or pain that you've had? Maybe you were in a car wreck recently. Or maybe you've been diagnosed with an illness. Or maybe you suffer from extreme migraines or something or somebody has caused you injury. And no matter how you've gotten hurt or how you received that pain, there is something that I'm sure we all probably do in the midst of pain. We cry out in pain. We may use a few choice words. Those choice words may escape our mouth from time to time. We may yell, and if you're anything like me, super pain intolerant, you may actually cry. I know I did when my back doubled over. And I know I continued to cry out in pain for the weeks afterward of just standing and sitting. When we experience physical pain, we cry out in pain, and there's something cathartic about that. Verbalizing that pain. And not only because that verbalization makes you feel better, but it often brings people to your aid. But what about spiritual pain? What are we supposed to do in light of any spiritual pain we may feel? I'm sure you have had much spiritual pain throughout your life. Whether it's short or long, you've experienced spiritual pain, but it might be harder to notice. While physical pain is very localized, like my lower back or your head for your migraine or your ankle if it's broken, spiritual pain can be internal. But it's no less painful. We can feel spiritual pain when we feel guilt or shame for something we've done, thought, or said, or something we haven't done, thought, or said. We can feel spiritual pain when someone or something makes us question our identity, not only as a human, but most importantly as a child of God. We experience spiritual pain when we're led to question our worth as God's creation. We experience spiritual pain when we begin to question God's love for us or even his care of us because of the fear that we may be consumed by. All of these things are deeply spiritual hurts. Deep spiritual pains, deep spiritual sadness, and they're extremely painful. So what do? Do we hold on to it? Do we let it fester? Do we allow it to consume us? No, in fact, this psalm, Psalm 3, shows us a better way. We lament. We cry out in spiritual pain, and we verbalize the hurt. Lamentations, is the spiritual expression of our pain, of our spiritual hurt, of our spiritual anger, and we actually are invited to do it, not just by David, but also by God. We're invited to cry out to God with our spiritual hurts, just like we cry out in pain for our physical hurts. But not only is it cathartic to lament, but most importantly, someone will come to help. In fact, someone has already come to help. Psalm 3, our psalm for today, begins with a lament of King David. So look with me, if you have your scriptures open, to Psalm chapter 3, just the first two verses. And listen to the spiritual pain of David. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. It's deep. It's consuming. It's surrounding him on all sides. But his lament, his spiritual pain is specific. It's not that there are many enemies that are physically surrounding him. He's experienced that before. It's something deeper than that. It's the seeds of doubt that are being planted by the enemy, by the words of those many who surround him. These words, "There is no salvation for you." The continued bombardment of that false truth is wearing King David out. It's beginning to create a crisis of faith, a spiritual hurt, a spiritual sadness, a deep spiritual pain. And so what does David do? He laments it. He cries it out to God. He cries out his spiritual pain to God. Now, back in March of last year, you may have seen a video of a doctor who put a piece of tape on his counter and put all his groceries on one side and some cleaning things in the middle, and then all clean groceries on the other side. Did you see that video on YouTube? Now, whether we want to say that that doctor was right or wrong, I did it for a while. And you may still be doing that. None of us knew really what to do back in March. I certainly didn't. And I didn't know what advice to give. There were so many people to listen to. There were so many doctors to get advice from. There were so many politicians giving orders. So many friends and colleagues sharing their fears. So many people, so many things, so many voices, so much so that at times it seemed as if the voice of God had been drowned out. But it's not just March and COVID and the pandemic. That's life. There are so many people, so many things, so many voices, so much all the time that many times, no matter what time we're in, the voice of God seems to have been drowned out. So many voices, so many people, so many things said. Sounds a bit like David's situation. Oh Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. David feared that God wouldn't save him. He was confronted with the reality by all these voices, all of these things, that God wouldn't save him as he was on the run from his very own son who wanted to kill him. He feared God wouldn't save him. Have you ever believed that? I could be wrong, but in all the news coverage I've watched over the past year, and I've probably watched more news in the past year than I have ever have in my entire life, I don't remember anyone ever saying specifically, be afraid of COVID. I never heard it. And yet, with all the graphs and the numbers and the videos and the pictures of people on ventilators and all the back and forth of what to do and what helps and what doesn't help, it led some of us to be so consumed by fear that our lives and actions and speech became ruled by it. Ruled by fear. David seemed to have lost his God-given identity as the anointed king of Israel. As his very own son assumed the throne, sending a coup against his father, David seemed to have lost his God-given identity. Have you ever questioned your God-given identity as a child of God? I think we all have, because the modern and most important question of our society today is, how do you identify yourself? And there are a myriad of answers. At times it could be political affiliation as the most important thing. It could be your education level, it could be your career, it could be your sexual orientation or your country of origin. So many different ways to identify yourself, and all of that leading us to question, who are we really? Have you ever questioned your identity like King David did? David may have been questioning his worth as the voices surrounding him told him he was on his own. Have you ever questioned your worth? I've heard a college professor say that a human's worth is dependent on their ability to make an impact in the world. Unfortunately, the idea of cultural impact is completely subjective. Depending on my grades or my job or my accomplishments, I could be of much worth to one person, but completely worthless to another, leading me to question my worth in the world. And maybe you've questioned your worth in this world. In the midst of all of this, all of these enemies and all of these voices, David may have begun to doubt the forgiveness of God. Has that ever happened to you? The voices aren't all coming from outside of us. There is also that little voice inside of us that convinces us that God's forgiveness is like everyone else's forgiveness. That God holds grudges. The things I've done wrong are just too great. Even worse, that all the things that are going wrong around me are God's punishment of my sin. All of this leading me to question whether I'm forgivable. David's crisis of faith was not unlike our crisis of faith. His struggle was not unlike our struggle. So many people, so many things, so many voices. It can be overwhelming. It can be fear-inducing. It can cause great spiritual pain. And many times with all the voices, all the people, all the things, the case seems closed. All the voices win by convincing us that we're on our own, that we're worthless, that we'll never be forgiven, that God doesn't care, that your identity isn't solid. And many voices seem to announce a final verdict to us like David heard. There is no salvation for you in God. But it's here, in response to that attempted verdict of all the voices, of all the enemies of David, of all of the people, David opens up the issue that his enemies considered closed. He opened it up in response to them by saying, well, if you say there is no salvation in him, I know that in Yahweh I have a shield around me. And he is my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. See, in the midst of that lament, in the midst of that spiritual pain, David recalls the promises of God that God made with him. That Yahweh, God himself, is his protector and shield, just like he delivered him from Goliath and King Saul. That Yahweh, God himself, gives him worth and identity, just like God anointed an unworthy shepherd boy to be king over God's people. That Yahweh, God himself, restores the one who experiences defeat and humiliation, just as God forgave David and restored David after an atrocious sin of adultery and murder. David confesses. He proclaims these things, but not just for himself. He proclaims them for all those who would hear this psalm for the first time and all those who would hear it after. That these, God's promises, God's voice, God's declaration, they are yours too. That God is your shield in the face of fear and in the face of death. That God is your glory, who gives you worth and identity as his child. that God lifts up your head, forgiving every sin, restoring your broken heart. The case is not closed until God says it's closed. And that's in fact where David takes us. David invites us to cry out aloud to God like he did, to lament our spiritual pain, to lament our spiritual struggle as we are being overwhelmed by so many, many, many voices outside of us and voices in our head. He invites us to lament our struggle and await an answer, a verdict from the holy hill of God. And God did answer David. And he does answer us. For David, that answer would come 1,000 years after he died, and for us, it would come 2,000 years before we do. Because God would and did answer from his holy hill as Jesus was dragged before the religious leaders in the temple in Jerusalem. Surrounded by so many people, so many things, so many voices, speaking lies, closing the case of this Jesus. This Jesus who would drag his own verdict of guilty through the street of God's holy city, Jerusalem, up another hill called Calvary. This Jesus who would be mocked and humiliated by so many people, so many things, so many voices. This Jesus who would face a similar verdict as David, a similar verdict as you and me from the world. There is no God who will save you. A case that seemed closed. Closed by the religious leaders, closed by the disciples, and closed by the devil himself. A case that in fact was closed. But not in the way anybody thought. It wasn't the voices of the many that was the final verdict. It was Jesus who announced the final verdict for David and for you. It's his final verdict from the holy hill of Calvary. It is finished. That salvation was done. Salvation belonged to God. God had saved us. He'd saved you. And to prove that case, to prove God's case even more powerfully, to make his point even more clearly, to proclaim the truth of God's salvation for you, that in fact there is salvation for you in God through Jesus, that in fact you have nothing to fear because you too will be resurrected just like Jesus, that in fact you have exceedingly more worth than you will ever know because you have been brought back from sin and death, bought back from sin and death by the power of the blood of God, that in fact your identity is gifted to you by God through the waters of baptism and not found in the world, that in fact you are forgiven more than you can ever imagine, washed clean and purer and whiter than snow. He did that by raising that Jesus from the dead. The verdict of death, it wouldn't come on Jesus and win. The verdict of life would. And that verdict has been given to you. Innocent, clean, pure, guilty, risen. David cried aloud in the midst of his spiritual pain, and so do we. God desires us to. But don't miss his answer. He answered you 2,000 years ago, and he continues to answer you today. He answers you through his word. He answers you through the sacraments. He answers you through the confession of David, through this proclamation of his word, the proclamation from your family, the proclamation as you read it. Cry out to God in lament. And remember by the power of the Holy Spirit that God has answered you in Jesus. And then like David, lie down. Rest, sleep, knowing that in Jesus you will always awake, whether to another day or when Jesus calls you from the grave. In the name and for the sake of Jesus, amen.